By the middle of the 1960s, an American childhood ran on electricity, not the kind in the walls. The kind that hummed under a little plastic car on a track stretched across a kitchen table. One company put it there: Aurora. Out of a single factory on Long Island, Aurora sold more than 25 million of those cars, turned department store aisles into raceways, and built a hobby that moved hundreds of millions of dollars a year. Then the building went quiet. The presses stopped. The name came off the box. Aurora did not fade the way old companies usually fade, slowly, with a long goodbye. It was taken apart on purpose, by men who never set foot on the factory floor. And here is the part that still does not sit right. The company is gone. The cars are not. So what killed Aurora? And why could nothing kill the thing Aurora made? That question has a clean answer and a true one, and they are not the same. The clean answer is that tastes change, that toys come and go, that nothing lasts. The true answer runs through a boardroom, a balance sheet, and a cracker company that had no business owning a slot car line. To understand how a building full of engineers lost control of what they built, you have to go back to the beginning. To a loft in Brooklyn in 1950, two partners with almost no money and a single steel mold. On a spring day in 1950, a clerk in New York stamped the paperwork that brought Aurora Plastics Corporation into the world. The men behind it were not toy makers. Joseph Yamarino was an engineer, a man who thought in tolerances and cooling times. Abe Shikes was a businessman, the one who watched the money. Together they had a small shop and a simple trade. They molded plastic parts for radios and appliances. The dull little pieces nobody notices, the kind that kept the lights on while they waited for a better idea. The better idea was a toy. In those years, a boy who wanted to build a model airplane or a model ship paid $4 or $5 for the privilege, and in 1950, that was real money. The famous names, Revell and Monogram, sold to families who could afford the hobby. Aurora looked at that price and saw a wall, so they decided to knock it down. Their first kits were simpler, with fewer parts, single-color bodies, no fancy decals, and they priced them low enough that a kid with a modest allowance could walk out of a hobby shop, holding the box instead of staring at it through the glass. It was a deliberate bet, and the math behind it was unforgiving. Lower price meant lower profit on every kit, which meant Aurora had to sell a great many kits to survive. Lower margin, higher volume. They lived or died on the factory floor. In 1952, they brought in a salesman named John Cuomo, and the company began turning out its own line in earnest. Aircraft first, then ships and cars. The early machines were modest. One injection press, 800 pounds of steel, hauled up a freight elevator, stamping out one body at a time, while a dozen men worked long hours in a room that smelled of hot plastic and machine oil. The molds were built for quick swaps, so the crew could rotate models every few weeks and keep the catalog fresh. The kits were simple by design, not by accident. Fewer parts meant less plastic. Less plastic meant a lower price. And a lower price meant the kid who could only dream of a Revell box could actually own an Aurora one. Each set used noticeably less material than the competition, and that discipline ran through everything the founders did. They were not building toys for collectors with deep pockets. They were building them for the boy with $2 and a Saturday afternoon. The snap-together design taught a whole generation the basics of patience and assembly, and it carried a message the founders never had to print on the box. Anyone could build. Anyone could play. What Aurora sold was never just a kit. It was the idea that anyone could build, that the hobby belonged to the boy with the small allowance as much as to the boy with the rich father. That idea built the company. It would also, in time, be the thing the new owners could not see, could not weigh, and could not save. By 1954, The Brooklyn loft had grown too small for the ambition inside it. Aurora signed for a plant in West Hempstead, out on Long Island, and the move was a gamble dressed up as progress. They took on a federal small business loan and a line of bank credit, the kind of debt that promises a future and demands repayment in the same breath. Overnight, the company doubled its floor space, and the payroll climbed from 15 workers to 45. The new building was all business. Rows of injection presses, quick change molds, and something Brooklyn never had room for, an electrical engineering department, the first in Aurora's history. That detail matters, because it points at where the company was about to go. Joseph Giammarino sketched plans for more complex molds. Abe Shikes leaned on suppliers for better rates now that Aurora bought resin by the ton. Many of the toolmakers and machinists they hired were newly arrived from a Europe still digging out of the war, men who knew steel and precision and were glad of steady work. The lean instinct never left the founders, but the scale was different now, and so was the risk. More machines meant more mouths to feed, more boxes to fill, more reasons the next product had to land. Every decision was a gamble. More presses meant more debt, and more debt meant the company could no longer afford a slow year. The extra room was an opportunity and a burden in the same breath, square footage that would not pay for itself until Aurora found its next big thing. The founders walked that floor, measuring it against the dream they had carried up the Brooklyn freight elevator a few years earlier, and they understood the bind they were in. Efficiency alone would not save them. They had to invent. Over the next decade, that plant would swell to 132,000 square feet, a small city of plastic under one roof. The next product did not come from an American basement. It came from across the ocean, from a British company called Playcraft, and a strange little system of cars that ran on a slotted track. Aurora bought the American rights and brought it home. The British design was clever and badly flawed. The cars were nicknamed vibrators, and they earned the name. They buzzed, they stalled, they rattled across the track more than they raced. The system had been built for tight English flats, not sprawling American homes, and the motor was a patchwork of stamped metal and vibrating bands. Cheap to build and never meant for marathon races across a living room floor. In England, children had shrugged at them. But Aurora's engineers looked past the noise and saw the bones of something, a platform they could rebuild for American living rooms. The fine print of the deal told them how much work lay ahead. They had to rescale the bodies, redesign the motor for American power, and retool the rails to fit what American kids expected. The first trials in West Hempstead confirmed the worst. The motors stalled. The early test sets came back under warranty. The engineers spent long nights chasing coil windings and gear ratios, trying to coax reliability out of a design that had none. The licensing contract had cast Aurora as an adapter, not an inventor. The men on the floor had other plans. They did not want to copy a foreign toy. They wanted to out-engineer it, and that ambition would soon outrun the contract that started it. Christmas of 1960 was the first. Aurora put a complete model motoring set on the shelves for $14.95. Track, transformer, 2 controllers, 2 cars, a whole world in a box. For a family earning a little over $5,000 a year, it was not a small purchase. It was a holiday splurge, and they made it anyway. By the end of December, Sears and Montgomery Ward were reporting sellouts. More than 200,000 sets shipped that first season, a number that startled even the optimists inside the company. The genius was not in the cars. It was in the box. Open it, snap the track together, and in minutes a parent and a child were racing side by side. No soldering, no special tools, no basement workshop. The instructions were written for a parent and child to read together. The controllers looked like little steering wheels,
See what we get.
and that small touch turned operation into play. The cars themselves still used the old British vibrator motor. Still noisy, still prone to stall, but for one Christmas the illusion held. A slice of the Indianapolis 500, scaled down to the kitchen table. The mail-order catalogs did the rest. The Sears wish book gave the Aurora set a full-color spread and made it the centerpiece of the holiday toy section, and the copywriters leaned all the way into the fantasy. Now a father and son could race together, right on the kitchen table. There was a reason it caught while the bigger systems did not. The grand layouts from rivals, like Scalextric and Revell, needed a whole room and a deeper wallet. Aurora's smaller scale fit on any table, packed away into a closet, and undercut the competition by a third. It was light enough for a child to carry, and simple enough that a family could set up a race in the time it took the cocoa to cool. By spring, Aurora was scrambling to fill back orders, and a phrase had entered the language of American childhood: model motoring. The illusion could not hold forever, and Aurora knew it. The buzz, the stall, the gears that wore out after a few hours of hard play. Every one of those flaws cracked the magic the moment a car shuddered to a halt mid-lap. So the company set its new electrical department on the problem. And the answer changed everything. In 1963, an engineer named Derek Brand gave Aurora a new kind of motor. Brand was British-born, trained on the original slot car idea back in England, and he designed for Aurora a flat disc-shaped motor that sat low and wide in the chassis. They called it the pancake because of the shape of the armature. Where the old vibrator coughed and lurched, the pancake delivered smooth, continuous power. The car hugged the track. It surged off the line instead of whimpering. It ran lap after lap without faltering, and it ran quiet enough to let a child believe. The detail work behind it bordered on obsession. The team paired the motor with a gear reduction that gave the car acceleration without the old stutter. They tested brush materials by the dozen, logging how each one wore and conducted after hundreds of laps, keeping the winners and discarding the rest in a growing archive of failed prototypes. They reprofiled the gear teeth to cut noise and stop the stripping that ruined the old cars. None of it showed on the shelf. All of it showed on the track. Fewer returns, happier customers. A car that could take the roughest play a kitchen table could throw at it. The difference was not only technical, it was emotional. The kids who had spent years coaxing a sputtering car along now held something that answered every twitch of the controller, and suddenly slot racing felt less like a toy and more like a sport. Aurora put that motor into a chassis called the Thunderjet, and the Thunderjet became, by most accounts, the best-selling slot car ever made. This was the moment the company stopped adapting someone else's idea and started owning its own. American engineering, solved in-house, aimed at one goal: to make the cars not just faster but believable. The factory floor that had once clattered with simple toys now hummed with something closer to real machines. What followed was not a fad. It was a wave. By 1965, more than 25 million Aurora slot cars had rolled out of West Hempstead. Across the country, slot racing became a national obsession, sold in department stores, advertised in the Sunday paper, stacked in the windows of hobby shops, from Long Island to Los Angeles. At its peak, the hobby supported more than 3,000 public tracks. Shopping centers ran tournaments that drew hundreds of entrants. One event in Chicago in 1966 pulled in some 1,200 racers, each one chasing the title of fastest in the Midwest. Local papers printed the race results next to the Little League scores. Clubs formed in church basements and veterans halls, their rosters full of kids, teenagers, and more than a few fathers who claimed they were only there to help the boys tune the cars. The competition grew as fast as the market. Kids traded tuning secrets in the schoolyard and pored over diagrams clipped from hobby magazines. The best racers could name a winning car by the sound of its motor and the tension of its brush springs. National magazines profiled teenage champions, and, for a stretch slot racing, became a proving ground for exactly the kind of technical curiosity that would later fill the country's engineering schools. The hobby was crossing every line of age and income. For every few sets sold to boys, one went to a grown man who remembered building model planes after the war, and who now found himself kneeling on the floor at midnight, dialing in a car for a race he told everyone was for his son. And here, at the very top, the warning was already there for anyone willing to hear it. The hobby was running at full throttle, and a thing running at full throttle has nowhere left to go but down. Aurora's own marketing began chasing older teens and adults, a quiet sign that the first wave of children was growing up. The empire looked unbreakable. Empires usually do, right before someone decides they are worth more in pieces. The founders saw it coming, or at least they saw their own exhaustion coming. Joseph Giammarino and Abe Shikes had carried the company for nearly 20 years, from a Brooklyn loft to a national craze, and by the late 1960s they were ready to step back. In 1969, they sold Aurora to outside investors and walked away. That is the moment the story turns. Not with a crash, with a signature. The men who bought Aurora did not build models. They read spreadsheets. The office that had belonged to an engineer who reviewed every mold now belonged to people who measured the company in quarters, not in chassis. The talk turned to consolidation, to efficiency, to modernizing. On the floor, the machinists and engineers who had trusted the founders heard those words and understood what they meant. Something had been traded away, and it was not coming back. Then the company changed hands again, and the new owner told you everything you needed to know about where it was headed. In 1971, Aurora was sold to Nabisco, a food company. A maker of crackers and cookies bought a slot car factory, not because it loved slot cars, but because in that era conglomerates bought everything, stacking unrelated businesses into a tower and calling it strategy. To Nabisco, Aurora was a line on a much larger page. There is a word for what changed, and the people on the floor used it without bitterness, the way you name a season. The company had been run by builders. Now it was run by counters. A builder asks what a thing should be and works backward to the cost. A counter asks what a thing costs and works backward to whatever it can still be sold as. Neither man thinks of himself as the villain, but put a counter in charge of a builder's company, and the ending is written before the first meeting is over. You do not invest in next year. You harvest this one. And a field that has been harvested, that hard grows nothing the season after. The warning signs were already on the page. The slot car boom had crested, and sales were sliding, with unsold inventory piling up in storerooms from Chicago to San Diego. Department store buyers who had once begged for exclusive layouts began handing that shelf space to action figures and the first electronic games. A company with vision would have answered by building something new. Aurora's new owners answered by cutting costs, and they cut them in the one place a toy company cannot afford to starve: research. You can see the result in the numbers that mattered. As rivals like Tyco and Carrera poured money into faster motors and flashier designs, Aurora's research budget was slashed nearly in half. New product proposals sat in filing cabinets. The engineers who had been the heart of the company found themselves sidelined and reassigned. The promising next generation of cars stalled, and the company fell back on recycling old chassis and old molds, selling yesterday's design to a market that had moved on. The technical edge that had made Aurora the standard for an entire generation began to dull, one canceled project at a time. Hobby shop owners noticed. So did the kids, who now held Aurora's aging cars next to the sleeker models from younger companies and saw the difference. The last act was the cruelest because it was so ordinary. After several years of losses, Nabisco did what conglomerates do with a line that no longer fits. It sold the problem. The buyer was a British company with a name that sounded like a law firm, Dunby Convex Marks, an Anglo-American toy group that already owned Scalextric, one of Aurora's old racing rivals. The price was $11.5 million. A company that had once defined an industry was now an item on someone's shopping list, bought by the people who had been trying to beat it. Dunby Convex Marks did not turn Aurora around. It could not. The factory had been starved of investment for years. The products had aged, and the new parent had troubles of its own. In 1980, the parent company collapsed, and when it went down, it took Aurora with it. The plant in West Hempstead, the small city of plastic that had filled 25 million boxes, went silent for good. There was no ceremony. The presses that had stamped out a generation of cars sat idle, their oil stains drying in the dust. The molds were tagged for auction and stacked in the dark like headstones. Workers left carrying cardboard boxes, a few of them clutching a faded catalog or a stray car shell pulled from the scrap bin, the last things made in a place that had made so much. For decades, that address had been stamped on every box, whispered in every hobby shop, a fixed point in a million childhoods. Now the halls held nothing but the echo of what they used to be. The numbers tell one version of what closed that day. The people tell another. These were the toolmakers who had come over from Europe with nothing and built a trade. The molders who knew the smell of a press by the sound it made. The men and women who had given a plant their 20s and their 30s and their backs, and who walked out at the end with a box and a handshake and a future they had not planned for. When a factory like that closes, a paycheck ends. But so does something harder to name. The thing a town tells itself about who it is. West Hempstead had made the toy that half of America grew up racing. Then it made nothing, and the people who had done the making were told the math no longer worked. The men who built Aurora had bet everything on a simple faith that if you made something good and made it affordable, people would come. They were right. The men who bought Aurora bet on something else, that a good name and a tired factory could be squeezed for a few more dollars before the lights went out. They were right too, and that is the quiet tragedy of it. Both bets paid. Only one of them built anything. Here is where the story should end, with a dead company and an empty building. It does not. Walk into a basement in Ohio or a garage on Long Island today and you may still hear it. The faint electric hum of an Aurora slot car running a track that was set up before the factory closed. The cars outlived the company that made them. Collectors number in the thousands, organized to clubs and online forums, trading parts, scanning old manuals by hand, rebuilding cars that left West Hempstead more than half a century ago. By their own accounting, nearly every original Aurora set can be brought back to life from parts found at a swap meet or traded across a forum, the whole catalog kept alive by hand. A pristine set, still sealed in its original box, can bring thousands of dollars at auction, more than the original buyer earned in a month. Museums keep Aurora controllers behind glass, beside the other icons of American play. The Henry Ford in Michigan treats a slot car controller as a piece of the country's story, because that is what it is. Online, collectors post their finds every week. A battered body rescued from a yard sale. A perfect chassis traded across the country. The hobby is smaller now. the heartbeat is steady. Because the thing Aurora actually made was never the plastic. It was the afternoon at the kitchen table, the father and the son leaning over the same track, the small electric thrill of control in a child's hand. You cannot put that on a balance sheet. You cannot sell it to a cracker company. You cannot shut it down by closing a factory. The empire died the way empires die, betrayed from the top, sold for parts, switched off by men who never understood what they owned. The race it started never did. They built those cars to last. The men who bought the company did not last half as long. And somewhere tonight, a small motor that a dead factory pressed into being is still running, still humming, still going around. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment about the one you remember. The track that took over the living room floor, the car you tuned until it flew, the hobby shop that knew your name. Maybe you raced an Aurora set as a kid. Maybe you worked a line like the one in West Hempstead, in a plant that built something real and then was sold out from under you. Tell us what it was and what it cost when the gates closed. Stories like this stay alive only when the people who live them speak up, so share this with someone who would understand. Subscribe if you want more of these, the empires American hands built and the decisions that brought them down. We read every comment. We are listening.